picking up where we left off in part one, we were talking about the Fugitive Slave Act, and we saw posters like this going up in places like Boston, advising anyone of color not to speak to police officers because they could be acting as kidnappers and slave catchers. And we talked about that there was a lot of money and success to be had here if you could round up enough people and sell them back into slavery or sell free blacks into slavery. Okay, then we kind of compared the North and the South. And we talked about several different attitudes here. We talked about slavery, where you had people like William Lloyd Garrison, the author of The Liberator, an outspoken abolitionist. You had Frederick Douglass, who rose from slavery to become one of the most successful, well-known, well-respected voices in the abolition debate. You've got Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which really turned a lot of hearts and minds to the plight of African Americans enslaved in the South. And then on the same number of states in the North, you've got people like the Irish who are coming over and trying to lift their own position by lowering the position of African Americans there, even ones that are free. So, you've got abolitionists in the North, and you've got people that support slavery and subjugation in the North on the same side. Now, in the South, here in the red, you've got a slave culture, definitely, but actually it was a very small percentage of Southerners that owned plantations and large numbers of slaves. Most families either did without slaves or they had one or two around the house. We don't really see a lot of the rolling plantations with countless slaves as is portrayed in a lot of movies and literature. And they're slowly getting better with recognizing that. But a lot of people were just too poor because it was an investment to have a slave. You don't just pay for purchasing, you pay for the clothing and the medical care and the upkeep and the housing and the food. So, it was kind of a diverse culture, and there were a lot of Southerners that were actually opposed to slavery, and some made the circuit up north. A couple famous sisters from South Carolina, the Grimke sisters. So then you've got states and populations in comparison. At the time of the war, and that's where these figures are coming from here, at the time of the eve of the Civil War, the North, the Union, had 23 states, plus they had the border states, and then they had territories. Their population was about 22 million, and 4 million were of fighting age at the time the war started. In the South, you've got 11 official Confederate states, and you've got limited border state assistance. So you do have troops from Missouri and from Kentucky marching for the Union and also for the Confederacy. And population-wise, they've got about 9 million. 3.5 million of that is slaves, and about 1.2 million of fighting age at the time. Economy, in the North, you've got about 100,000 factories and about 1.1 million workers. In the South, you've only got 20,000 factories. Remember, it was much more agricultural with about 101,000 workers. In the North, you've got about 20,000 miles of rail, which was roughly 70% of all the rail in the United States. And in the South, you only have 9,000 miles of rail, which is why when we get to the Civil War and we talk about a lot of these early battles, it's going to be around rail junctions, like at Manassas, because the Confederacy is going to want to hold on and protect what they have. Okay, another thing that's going to lead to the Civil War as far as slavery goes is this idea that comes out of the Dred Scott decision, or this precedent. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom after his master had died, who was in the medical corps with the military and traveled around. And he lived in free states for a good chunk of his life. And so upon his master's death, he sued for freedom. makes it to the Supreme Court in Missouri in St. Louis at the old courthouse, and the Taney Court denies him his freedom. They say that blacks are not citizens and therefore not entitled to the rights of citizens, and therefore really has no right to even sue in a court. And they also announced that Congress cannot outlaw slavery. So some of these territories, remember, that were coming in with the Compromise of 1850 and a little later on, they are going to give them popular sovereignty, the permission to decide free or slave. And now Congress says you can't do that. If you cannot outlaw slavery in a territory. So really what this does is it denies civil rights and it opens territories to slavery. Then there's the whole states' rights argument, which we've repeated several times throughout our learning so far this year. It goes back to Jefferson, who was this idea of small central government, more powerful state governments, more participation by the people. And couple of the big instances we saw with states' rights, Jackson refused to allow the national road to go through Kentucky because Kentucky didn't want it. And we saw South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union because of the Tariff of Abominations. And in 1833, Congress approved to crush any kind of rebellion there. So we have seen the states' rights argument played out again and again and again in history up until this point when the Civil War starts. So the Missouri Compromise here, 1820, moving on to the failed compromises section. Now this coin by the Franklin men is just ironic, and that's why I chose this one, because Missouri enters the Union in 1820, and the Missouri Compromise, of course, outlawed slavery north of the 3630 line, which is the Missouri-Arkansas border. And so we've got this coin on here depicting the Underground Railroad and slaves sneaking to freedom, and you've got some slave catchers there on their trail. But Missouri was actually one of the states that kept slaves even through the Civil War. So although Lincoln emancipates the slaves in the 11 official Confederate states with the Emancipation Proclamation, you still have Missouri, who is holding slaves until 1865. So it's just kind of an ironic coin. Way to go, Franklin men. All right. Henry Clay, the child eater himself here, is one of the key authors, or really the key motivation in pushing this thing through here at the federal level. And here you can see a map of just what it did. Free states and territories and slave states and territories. So you can kind of see where the Missouri Compromise brought this whole idea of balance into play. And that was the deal. This is why when President Taylor advises California to enter as a free state, it's such a big deal, because ever since 1820, since the Missouri Compromise, it has to be balanced. You have to have a slave state come in with a free state. That is why when Missouri entered as a slave state, and it was peopled largely by Southerners, you've got Maine coming in as a free state. So if we look at some maps, we can see how the ideas of states and slavery has changed over time. Here we are in 1820. You can see the blue are slave states, green are free states and territories, and then the brown or tan there is territories that will be unorganized. In 1850, we can see that the unorganized territory is going to become free, and that is because of the Dred Scott decision. So we've got all this territory here, and then now look at the green. So it seems like that the free state men are winning out across the country. Then you've got popular sovereignty, where the people can decide. In 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act. So again, I mean, if we watch the progression, we can see the green is going to get a lot more numerous, and the blue is not really going to grow all that much. They're kind of blocked out. And you can see here that they're going to want to push into these territories. So pay special attention to Kansas, because that is the closest place for all these slave states to move into and to capture. that struggle is going to lead to something that's known as Bleeding Kansas or Bloody Kansas. So, and it's all going to revolve around the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So images like this, the looting and burning of the Planters Hotel, the whole reason that until Missouri joined the SEC, the reason that there was the conflict between Kansas and Missouri, that whole Jayhawk or Tiger debate goes back to before the Civil War with Bleeding Kansas. Even the names of the mascots go back to Bleeding Kansas before the Civil War. Now, popular sovereignty is the idea that the people can choose, they can vote whether to become slave or free. And that was an idea that was popularized by Stephen Douglas, who was one of the authors of the Compromise of 1850. So in 1854, Kansas and Nebraska territory want to enter into the Union. And it's going to give popular sovereignty to the people. So this is when the mess all starts in Kansas. Now, most people had assumed that Missourians who were pro-slavery, at least in the areas closest to Kansas, they would get Kansas, and Nebraska would get people from Iowa who were more anti-slave. It was a free state. And so even though popular sovereignty did away with the Missouri Compromise for the most part, it was still kind of clinging to that idea of one slave and one free, because they were just assuming that Kansas would go slave and Nebraska would go free because of the states right next door to them. But what we have is, instead of popular sovereignty, we have radicals from both sides coming in and taking the vote away from settlers. You've got Missouri sending over what were nicknamed border ruffians, and they were voting pro-slavery. You know, there was one ballot count where there were about 2,000 people registered in this particular place, and you've got about 6,000 votes. So obviously people are voting more than once, or there's a lot more people coming over just to vote and then splitting. They also did things like requiring you to stake a claim in order to vote. So people would come over and hammer in 4 stakes in the ground and say, "This is my land," and then they would go vote. The Immigrant Aid Society, the abolitionists were not innocent in this, though, and they sent over countless numbers of people from the East in order to vote to make Kansas a free state. So the numbers, though, are going to favor slavery, and they're going to draft something called the Lecompton Constitution. So popular sovereignty, even though it was not official and it was not fair, the votes favored the pro-slave men. And so they won the day, and they're going to draft a constitution in Lecompton, Kansas, and it's going to be very, very harsh. It's really going to lay the law down on anti-slavery men. So abolitionists who do not feel that the pro-slavery men really won the day are going to form a separate government in Lawrence. So you're going to have 2 different governments trying to run this new state of Kansas. So that's in 1854. 1855 is the beginning of the Wakarusa War, and that's going to be these conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery men, and it's just going to escalate year after year. 1856, the slave state supporters are going to sack Lawrence. They're going to attack the Planters Hotel. They're going to throw printing presses into the river. It's just going to be a big, bloody mess. You're going to see in Congress, you're going to see Preston Brooks attack Charles Sumner. Sumner was a representative from Massachusetts, and he was an anti-slavery man, and he is insulting the Missourians and the border ruffians and the pro-slavery men in Kansas. And Preston Brooks, whose uncle was insulted, takes that very seriously and beats the man nearly to death with his gold-tipped cane. And so, it was quite a mess that did not just affect Kansas and Missouri, but went all the way into the halls of Congress. And so here you can see this rendition of that. So, I mean, if you look at it, try to figure out which side is this